Hi guys, my name is Beth, and I'm going to be doing my chapter presentation over Chapter 7, which is about words and meanings, English learners' vocabulary development. So I'm going to start off by just giving an overview of the chapter, some of the questions that I have on here are: how do we assess English learners' vocabulary progress? What does research show about English learners' vocabulary development? What kinds of words do students need to know? What are some beginning and intermediate English learner characteristics and strategies? How do we differentiate vocabulary assessment and instruction? And how do students learn new words? So the first thing I'm going to talk about is, what does research show about English learners' vocabulary development? So when children are in kindergarten, they know about 5,000 words versus when they're in high school, they know about 18,000 words by the time they graduate. So obviously there's a lot of vocabulary development in that range. And so EL students who come into our classrooms will probably not be at that level of English acquisition, but it doesn't mean that they cannot make significant gains in the time that they are in our classroom. The best way to provide a solid basis for students learning new English vocabulary is to expose the students to that vocabulary across a variety of contexts and in both oral and written form. Some approaches that work really well with ELLs include sheltering, scaffolding, cognates, which we'll talk about a little bit later, and teaching vocabulary words in the student's primary language and also in English. Some other approaches, which are mentioned in Figure 7.1 of the textbook, are frequent repetitive exposure, preview before reading, acting out words, build on background knowledge, and set aside specific time for vocabulary teaching. So now we're going to talk about productive versus receptive vocabulary. So when you're teaching students new vocabulary, teachers need to refer back to the four main aspects of literacy instruction, which are speaking, writing, reading, and listening. And so receptive vocabulary involves the student recognizing and understanding the words, whereas productive vocabulary involves the students using the word in his or her vocabulary. So receptive oral vocabulary is when the student recognizes and understands the word when he or she hears it. Receptive written vocabulary is when the student is able to recognize and understand the word when he or she comes across it while reading. Productive oral vocabulary is when the student can accurately use the new word when speaking, and productive written vocabulary is when the student can accurately use the new word when writing. And you can refer back to Figure 7.2 on page 254 in the textbook for a visual of all of these definitions. So now we're going to talk about aspects of word knowledge. So in addition to knowing the different ways to use the word in everyday life, the teacher also needs to teach the student about the form, meaning, and use and context of the word. With English being the wonderfully complicated language that it can be, the same word can have different meanings and spellings across different contexts, which can be really difficult for ELLs to grasp, especially since some native English speakers like myself even mess up that sometimes. When thinking about the form of the word, the teacher needs to consider how the word sounds, how it's pronounced, how it's spelled, and the parts of the word that have the meaning, like the prefixes and suffixes. When thinking about the meaning of the word, the teacher needs to think about the context that the word is being used in. And then the best way that the students can learn about the variety of contexts and meanings of the word is by exposing them to the word in various contexts and practice using the word in those contexts. So what kind of words do students need to know? There are three tiers of vocabulary words that students need to know. There are your high-frequency words, your general academic words, and then there are domain-specific academic content area words. So high-frequency words is obviously your biggest category. They're the common words that are used in everyday talking and reading. By the time students know their first 2,000 words, they know about 90% of the words used in everyday conversation and about 78% of the words used in academic texts. So the first 2,000 words a student knows will help them understand and participate in social conversations. But as far as academic language and conversation, they need to develop their vocabulary further. So there are some sight word lists or high-frequency word lists like the Dolch and the Fry list that include function words such as the, to, I, he, a, of, and in. So the best way for students to learn these high frequency words is by frequent exposure and repetition of the word. Just keep on talking about that word over and over again. So general academic words are the words that stretch across all domains such as analyze, summarize, and theory. And then there's academic content words, which are words that occur within specific subject areas like social studies, math, or science. So like in history, you have the Emancipation Proclamation. You're not going to find the term Emancipation Proclamation in math or in science or another content area. So how do students learn new words? In order for students to completely understand a new vocabulary word, they need to understand its breadth, which is known for its various use and meanings across context, and its depth, which is fully understanding the meaning of the word. When introducing new academic vocabulary, the ideas represented by the vocabulary tend to be more abstract and really complex. So it's really beneficial for the students if the teacher can provide a concrete example or a visual to go along with the word. So here are 5 guidelines that the book lists when teaching new words to students. So number 1, relate the new to the known. Offer repetitions of the word in meaningful contexts. Provide opportunities for deeper processing of word meaning. Engage students in using newly learned words. And provide explicit instruction strategies. So now I'm going to talk about some guidelines for creating vocabulary lessons. So when thinking about designing lessons for your ESL students, it is important to expose them to new words during academic instruction, which are supported by cues to meaning and opportunities for concept development. Offer experiences in reading a variety of materials independently and under your guidance, the teacher. Opportunities to write frequently for an audience. Explicit instruction on words and word parts. Instruction on vocabulary strategies, including dictionary use, to help students read and write new words independently. And then all these activities will help the students develop their word consciousness, which is where the students are able to recognize, understand, and use the new words. So when it comes to independent reading for ELLs, the books picked out for ESL students needs to be in their independent reading range, which means they know about 95% of the words in the text. That way the student feels confident enough to read the book, but he or she can also apply the new strategies that the teacher has already taught about decoding words. Teachers can explicitly teach individual words prior to the student reading the text by analyzing the different parts of the word, which goes back to the prefixes and suffixes we talked about. Over time and repeated exposure to the new words, the students will develop fluency and instantly recognize and use the words in everyday language. The vocabulary strategies that teachers teach their students need to be based on the balance approach, which means that the students need to know how to use the words in speaking, reading, writing, and listening, as well as in and out of natural communication contexts. So how do we differentiate vocabulary assessment and instruction? So when differentiating instruction for ELL students, teachers need to think about the 4 aspects of the student's age and grade, the English proficiency level of the student, both orally and written, the student's primary language proficiency, both oral and written, and the student's previous educational experiences. When taking all 4 of these criteria into consideration, the teacher needs to make sure that the new vocabulary words they selected are developmentally appropriate and focus on the curriculum content at hand. And so in the presentation here, I put a picture of figure 7.6 from the textbook, and it just talks about the key elements of vocabulary instruction. And so it talks about teacher selected and student selected, text, informal and formal ongoing assessment, high frequency words and other selected words that are explicitly taught, and then strategies for learning words that are taught, like using prefixes, suffixes, context, and then dictionaries. So English language proficiency considerations. When thinking about assessing a student's level of English proficiency, the teacher needs to consider how much English the student knows, because that will impact how the student is initially assessed. For example, for a student who is new to English and is not very proficient, the teacher might select a sight word list, such as the Friar Dolch, and ask the student about the first 500 words or so. Not all 500 words, but pick from the first 500 words. A student with more English proficiency or an intermediate ELL student will probably know those first 500 words or so. so the teacher can move on to maybe the next 1,000 or 1,500 or even 2,000 on the sight word list. So depending on the background of each student, the teacher can plan assessments according to each student's needs. For example, a student may have had formal English instruction in his or her home country, and they may feel more comfortable writing English than speaking it. Some other students may have learned strategies on learning new words, such as memorization and word association, which they can use with their future vocabulary. So some primary language proficiency considerations. Knowing which language your students primarily speak is important because certain languages transfer to English very well. For example, both Spanish and English are based off the Roman alphabet and therefore have many similarities, which means that Spanish-speaking students are able to make some connections between Spanish and English. It's easier for them. On the other hand, Chinese is a logographic language, and so it's much more difficult for Chinese students to make connections to English. One way for vocabulary transfer to occur is through the use of cognates, which are words that look and sound similar in two languages. So, for example, we have the English word telephone, and in Spanish, I don't speak Spanish, so forgive me, telefono. So they look very similar, and you can see the word on my presentation, but they look very similar and they sound very similar. So that way that's a cognate, and so the Spanish-speaking students can make that connection to the English word telephone. So some cognates are friendly, which means that they share the same meaning, but other cognates are called false cognates because they have different meanings in two languages, despite the fact that they look and sound similar. So before you start teaching kids about cognates, you need to make sure not to include false cognates because that would just get them confused. A way to make sure that the languages of all your students are met is to have a multilingual word wall. The students can go see the English word and think about the corresponding word in their language. And that works for if you have multiple languages present in your class. That way you're not just focusing on just Spanish or just Chinese or you're not just focusing on one language. Vocabulary assessment prior to instruction. So before differentiating instruction, the teacher needs to determine where each student is in relation to the content standards, goals, and objectives. Prior to teaching a lesson, the class can brainstorm about the topic individually, in pairs, or in groups. The students can then share what they know, and the teacher can get a better grasp on what the students know and use that knowledge to inform the vocabulary instruction. Another activity that students can do to prepare for vocabulary instruction begins by giving the students a short list of vocabulary words that are geared for each student's instructional level. Next, the teacher asks the students if they recognize the word, can define the word, can use the word in a sentence, and can use the word in different contexts. The teacher can administer this assessment orally or give the students a chart to fill out and then assist the students in filling out the chart. This activity can be differentiated for beginning ELLs by offering simple pictures instead of the words, or for more advanced ELLs by giving the students more complex pictures or even a wordless book. So, dictionaries as a resource for differentiating instruction. There are 3 types of dictionaries that teachers can use for ELL instruction, and they can be chosen based on the student's grade level and proficiency level. So there are picture dictionaries, bilingual dictionaries, and monolingual language learner dictionaries. Picture dictionaries are designed for all ages, from elementary and or beginning level ELLs to older and more advanced ELLs. Some examples of picture dictionaries are the Harcourt Brace Picture Dictionary and the Ultimate Picture Dictionary. And those are hard copy books, but then there are also some online picture dictionaries such as Enchanted Learning. And those just have the word and then a picture associated with it. Bilingual dictionaries are a great source for students who are literate in their first language, and so students can look up the word in their primary language and then find the equivalent in English. An example of a bilingual dictionary is Simon & Schuster's International Spanish Dictionary. Monolingual language learner dictionaries have definitions all in English, but they use a restricted vocabulary, and then in some cases they only use the first 2,000 words that the students are supposed to learn, so like those high frequency words. Some examples of a monolingual language learner dictionary include the Collins-Colville Learner's Concise English Dictionary and Longman Dictionary of Contemporary English. So, beginning English learner characteristics and teaching strategies. Beginning level ELLs have only a basic understanding of the English language, and so it would benefit the students for the teacher to use the first 500 to 1,000 words from sight word lists such as fry and dolce or high frequency words. Teachers also need to be aware of the vocabulary words associated with their content instructions, as these words tend to be a little bit more difficult for students to understand. These academic vocabulary words can be highlighted during lessons, and the students can practice using the words in a meaningful context and exploring the multiple meanings of the word. Some of the vocabulary the students can study can be related to day-to-day classroom activities, such as a classroom and lunch routines, as well as student and teacher-led centers. So now we're going to talk about total physical response, or TPR. So total physical response occurs when the teacher pairs words with actions and gestures. So for example, when the teacher says stand up, she will motion for the students to stand up. And then as the student's vocabulary grows, the teacher can use more sophisticated commands such as put the book on the table, and the students will respond accordingly. So a game that teachers can do along the lines of total physical response would be Simon Says. And Simon Says would be useful for students beginning English acquisition because the actions done in the game demonstrate word meaning. Also, the students can show their comprehension by responding to the commands, and the students do not need to speak during the game. And so that's why it's more geared towards more students beginning English acquisition. Another strategy would be for read alouds. I mean, we've all been told that it's really important for students of all ages, from pre-K to 12th grade, to hear words being read to them in class, to hear read alouds. ELLs specifically benefit from read alouds because they're exposed to different genres of literature, as well as the sound, organization, and flow of English. For beginning ELLs, teachers need to choose short selections like poems, song lyrics, and brief stories that are based around familiar topics to the ELLs. That way they can relate the information back. The teacher needs to be sure to activate the students' prior knowledge of the topic and related vocabulary. Long stretches of listening to a reading can be very taxing on students, especially ELLs, so teachers need to be sure to keep the content short. Another strategy is word cards. Word cards are cards that have the English word on one side and then have a picture, short definition, or translation on the other side. Students can create their own cards to meet their own interests or needs, or the content related to what you're teaching. Students can keep the word cards with them so they can practice with a friend anytime. If you have a few minutes between the end of your lesson and lunchtime, and someone else is done, they can go and they can practice with their word cards. Students can complete word sorts using their word cards, which is where the students sort the words into categories. Word cards can be used at any grade level and can be used with high frequency words or content specific vocabulary. You could probably have a set of word cards that include high frequency words, and then maybe some some word cards with some content specific vocabulary. Another strategy would be a word wall dictionary, which are an easy resource for ELLs to reference because they're listed in alphabetical order on one of the classroom walls. The words can be related to the content or words that relate to the students themselves. The ABC order of word walls allow for students to connect the idea of the word walls to dictionaries, which also go in ABC order, so that'd be a good segue into teaching about dictionaries and how to read dictionaries. There are lots of vocabulary games and activities online that students can play through YouTube and Dave's ESL Cafe. That's another site you can go on to. Another strategy is working with idioms. So ELLs can really struggle with idioms because they take the meaning of them literally. Like if you say it's raining cats and dogs outside, they look outside to see if it's actually raining cats and dogs, bless their hearts. With there being so many idioms, it would be helpful for teachers to discuss certain idioms whenever they come up, whether it be in classroom discussion or in a book. Students can create a class idiom book where students take turns writing down and illustrating different idioms. An activity that teachers can do with students would be to find songs the students are interested in and have the students try to figure out the meaning of the idiom. So, intermediate English learner characteristics and teaching strategies. ELLs who are at the intermediate stage of English acquisition may know a lot of the first 2,000 high-frequency words. Depending on the prior educational experience of the students, intermediate ELLs can read graded text and authentic text. When teaching intermediate ELLs, teachers need to make sure to reinforce and teach the remaining high-frequency words as well as cross-curricular and content-specific vocabulary. So some strategies for intermediate ELLs would be word wheels, which are a visual way for students to learn about multiple synonyms of one word. So the wheel would have like the main word in the center and then with various synonyms of the main word written around it. So after learning about the main word, the students can discuss the various synonyms and how they relate to the main word. The students can then use the synonyms in their everyday writing and speaking, which will help them with their language acquisition, and then they also get really excited about using variations of words. Another strategy would be language wheels. And these are typically for ELLs in like middle school or high school because they originally help students with verb conjugation. So like for example, I sing, I sang, and I have sung. They can be adapted for adjective and adverb forms as well to help students avoid false cognates. Language wheels are made of tagboard on the bottom with a smaller piece of tagboard on the top, which can be turned like a dial. And so students can focus on one of the verbs at one time or one of the adjectives. That way they don't get confused. Vocabulary self-collection strategy. Each student picks out one word from a reading that he or she considers important, then the entire class makes a list, with the teacher adding in some words as well. Once the class has completed the list, the teacher will guide them in discussing and defining each of the words. Then the class will go through and select words that they know or that they think are important to the text, and the students can break up into pairs and quiz each other on the words. This strategy is beneficial for all students because the students have an active part in the lesson by picking out the vocabulary words, and then the students also gain a strong sense of the meaning and use of each word. Another benefit to the self-collection strategy is that the students learn to take charge of their own vocabulary development. So word wizards can take place after the students learn about a new vocabulary in class. They can take note of when and where they see the vocabulary words used outside of class, like in magazines or on TV. The students then come in and explain to the class how the word was used and what context the word was used in, like where they saw it at. This activity allows students to see how different words are used outside of the academic setting, and it also creates enthusiasm in students for learning and listening for new vocabulary. Contextual redefinition. Contextual redefinition is a strategy where students figure out unknown words by using context. Teachers can pick a sentence from a story that includes a word students may not be familiar with, present it to the class, and ask students to say what the word means. After hearing some possibilities, the teacher will present the word in the sentence and ask the students to define the word, and then the students can go and look it up in the dictionary. The teacher can also think out loud by modeling what their student thought process should be like. So, list, group, label, map for elementary and secondary students. List, group, label, map involves students working in groups to brainstorm words that relate to a topic. Next, the students group words that are alike, then make a category name for each group, and then the students create a map that shows the relationship between all of the words, and then each group shares their map with the rest of the class. Another option is for the teacher to write down the words on the board, and the entire class can create the categories and map. This strategy helps students with new words and their meanings because the students orally talk about and brainstorm the words, and the students see the written words on the board. Another advantage to this activity is that the students gain experience in visualizing and mapping words, which will help the students in making connections to prior knowledge and new learning. So vocabulary journals are kind of an extension of the word card activity. So whenever the students come across a new vocabulary word, they write it down in their journal along with a sentence using the word and any other information that would help them remember the meaning. The students can then use their journal to review for quizzes and tests, and then when the student comes across the word again, he or she can add more sentences to the definition. Then in the presentation here, I have included like a template. That's just something that I found online, but it would be a good template to use, especially for maybe some beginning ELL students. That way it will help them kind of streamline their thought process. So teaching students how to use dictionaries effectively. So dictionaries are a really powerful tool that ESL students have at their disposal, but it is kind of difficult for them to learn how to use them. I mean, I remember but it was difficult for me to learn how to use them. So figure 7.11 in the textbook, which I have a picture of included in my presentation, is a step-by-step way to show students how to use the dictionary. The chart can be modified to each student or each class's grade level, how mature they are, and then the English proficiency level of the students or class. And then you can model each of the steps by looking up a word in the dictionary yourself. So teaching prefixes and suffixes. Knowledge of prefixes and suffixes is important for ELLs because many words include prefixes and suffixes, and knowing their meaning could help students understand a word that they don't know. So some common prefixes and suffixes include ed, ing, rein, im, dis, en, tion, and ment. The best way to teach students about prefixes and suffixes is to first explain what they are and how they are important to a word's meaning. It would help students to see some examples of prefixes and how they change a word's meaning. Model student thinking by showing the students how to guess the meaning of a word based on the prefix or suffix given. Give students a list of words and have them try and figure out the meaning of the word based on the prefix or suffix, then go over the answers as a group and have different students share their thought process. So how do we assess ELL's vocabulary progress? So teachers can formally assess students' vocabulary progress by observing students and then just taking anecdotal notes on their process while they work in collaborative or small groups. Teachers can also collect student journals or student-made dictionaries and analyze their work and make a note of each student's strengths and weaknesses and how well each student is progressing. Another way to assess students' vocabulary progress is by hearing the student use the vocabulary, explain the meaning of the vocabulary word, and then use the word in a correct context. A traditional way to assess student vocabulary progress would be through multiple choice tests or a matching items test. Testing is a quick and easy way to get a sense of students' knowledge of vocabulary, and it can be administered to the whole class at one time, but I would use it sparingly just because it really is a struggle for some ELL students. So I will post my discussion questions to iLearn, and thanks for watching.